Amara Jenkins had always been cautious, aware of her surroundings, and careful in every step she took in life. As a black woman in America, her grandmother had ingrained in her the importance of keeping her head down, of being invisible when necessary, but also of knowing when to rise. "Always stand tall, baby, but know when it's time to keep quiet," her grandmother used to say. Amara never forgot those words. It had shaped her into the woman she was. Intelligent, successful, and always aware of the space she took up in the world. It was a rainy Thursday when everything started to unravel. Amara had just finished a long day at her job as a defense attorney in Chicago. She worked tirelessly on cases that often seemed stacked against her clients from the start. Today had been no different. Her client, a young black man, had been wrongfully accused of a crime he didn't commit. Amara knew he was innocent, but getting the courts to see it was another battle entirely. As she walked out of her office building, her umbrella barely holding back the downpour, her mind wandered. She thought about her next steps in the case. There was evidence that hadn't been properly submitted, and she was certain that if she pushed a little harder, she could get the charges dropped. But the system was slow, and she was tired. So very tired. She shook her head, trying to focus on the task at hand. Getting home. She waved down a cab, climbed in, and gave the driver her address. The city lights blurred as they passed by, the rain streaking the windows in thin streams. She leaned back and closed her eyes, trying to decompress. The cab had barely made it halfway to her apartment when the flashing red and blue lights lit up the back seat. The driver, a middle-aged man with graying hair and kind eyes, looked at her through the rearview mirror. "I'm not sure what this is about, ma'am. I wasn't speeding." Amara's stomach dropped. She had seen this scenario play out too many times, both in life and in court. She kept her hands visible on her lap and nodded at the driver. "It's okay. Just pull over." The cab came to a slow stop on the side of the road. The rain beat down harder, the sound filling the silence in the car. Two officers approached from the back, their figures distorted by the raindrops on the window. Amara could feel her heartbeat quicken. She hadn't done anything wrong, yet her entire body was tense with the anticipation of what was about to happen. One of the officers, a tall man with a stern expression, motioned for her to roll down the window. She complied, her hands shaking slightly. "Ma'am, step out of the vehicle," the officer said, his voice flat and commanding. Amara's brow furrowed. "Is there a problem, officer?" The officer didn't respond. He simply repeated, "Step out of the vehicle." With a deep breath, Amara opened the door and stepped into the rain. Her suit clung to her body, the water soaking through almost immediately. The officer didn't even look at her as he reached for her wrists, pulling them behind her back and locking the cold metal handcuffs around them. "What's going on?" Amara demanded, her voice louder now, her fear turning to frustration. She had done nothing wrong. This couldn't be happening. "You're under arrest," the officer said, his grip firm as he guided her toward the police car. "For what?" Amara's mind raced. Had they mistaken her for someone else? Was this some kind of setup? "Just get in the car," the officer said, ignoring her question. The other officer, a younger man with an uncertain expression, watched from the side but said nothing. Amara's heart pounded in her chest as she was pushed into the back seat of the police car. The rain continued to fall, the sound muffling everything around her. Her mind was spinning, trying to figure out what could possibly be happening. She was a lawyer, for God's sake. She knew her rights. She knew that this was wrong. The ride to the station was a blur. Amara sat in stunned silence, her hands still cuffed behind her back, her body pressed awkwardly against the seat. When they arrived at the precinct, the officers led her inside, still offering no explanation. Her wet clothes clung to her skin, and her hair dripped water onto the cold tile floor as she was marched down a hallway and into a small, dimly lit room. They left her there, handcuffed to the metal table, without a word. The door closed with a heavy thud, and she was alone. For what felt like hours, Amara sat in that room, staring at the walls, trying to piece together what could possibly be happening. She thought about calling someone, but her phone had been taken when they brought her in. She thought about demanding answers, but the look in the officer's eyes when he had arrested her told her it wouldn't do any good. Finally, the door opened, and a man in plain clothes walked in. He looked older, in his late 40s or early 50s, with salt and pepper hair and tired eyes. He sat down across from her, placing a file on the table between them. "Ms. Jenkins," he began, his tone softer than the officers who had arrested her. "I'm Detective Harris. I'd like to ask you a few questions." Amara's jaw clenched. "I'd like to know why I'm here." Detective Harris sighed and opened the file. "We have reason to believe you've been involved in a case we've been investigating." "A case?" Amara's eyebrows shot up. "What case?" Harris flipped through the papers in front of him, though Amara suspected it was more for effect than necessity. "There's been some suspicion of your involvement in a drug trafficking operation." Amara blinked. For a moment, she wasn't sure if she'd heard him correctly. "Drug trafficking? Are you serious?" "I'm afraid so," Harris said, his voice calm, almost apologetic. "We've been tracking a ring operating out of Chicago for the last few months, and your name came up during our investigation." Amara's blood ran cold. This was beyond absurd. She was a lawyer, an officer of the court. She had spent her entire career fighting for justice, and now they were accusing her of being involved in something so criminal, so vile. "This is a mistake," she said firmly. "I have nothing to do with any drug ring. I'm a lawyer, not a criminal." Harris leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully. "I understand that this is a lot to take in, but we have evidence that suggests otherwise." "Evidence?" Amara's voice rose. "What evidence? I demand to see it." Harris hesitated for a moment before he stood up and walked to the door. "I'll be back shortly," he said before leaving the room again. Alone once more, Amara's mind raced. This couldn't be happening. It had to be some kind of mistake. But as the minutes dragged on, her fear grew. What if they really had evidence? What if someone had framed her? She had made enemies in her line of work, that much was certain. But who would go this far? By the time Detective Harris returned, Amara was ready to explode. She had replayed every possible scenario in her head, and none of it made sense. She opened her mouth to demand answers again, but Harris spoke first. "We've looked into your background," he said, sitting down across from her once more. "We know about your family, your work, your connections, but there's something we didn't expect." Amara stared at him, confused. "What are you talking about?" Harris took a deep breath. "Your father, Ms. Jenkins." Her heart skipped a beat. Her father? She barely knew the man. He had left when she was just a baby, and her mother had rarely spoken of him since. She had grown up without him, never knowing where he went or what kind of life he led. She had tried to track him down once or twice, but it had always led to dead ends. "What about him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Harris slid a piece of paper across the table. Amara hesitated before picking it up. When she did, her eyes widened in shock. It was a photo of her father. The man in the picture was older, but there was no mistaking it. He had the same strong jawline, the same piercing eyes, but there was something else. He was dressed in what looked like military attire, though not of any branch she recognized, and there, stitched onto his uniform, was a name. A name she hadn't heard in years, a name she had all but forgotten. He wasn't just her father. He was a man with a secret life, a life that had just come crashing down on her own. Amara's world shifted in an instant. She wasn't being targeted because of her work or because of her race or even because of some random mistake. She was being targeted because of who she was, because of who her father was. And now, she realized with a sinking feeling, she was in far more danger than she ever could have imagined. Before she could even process the implications, Harris stood and gestured for her to follow him. The cuffs were removed, and she was led down a series of hallways deeper into the precinct. They passed rows of offices and interrogation rooms before finally arriving at a door marked Restricted Access. Harris swiped a keycard, and the door clicked open. Inside was a high-tech room with monitors lining the walls, each one showing different parts of the city. Officers and analysts sat at desks, typing furiously or talking into headsets. This wasn't just a precinct, it was something much bigger. As Harris guided her to a small office at the back of the room, Amara's mind raced with questions. But when she entered the office, the man sitting behind the desk made everything clear in an instant. "Ms. Jenkins," the man said, his voice deep and authoritative, "I'm Director Collins. We've been waiting for you." Amara stared at him, confused. "Waiting for me? Why?" Collins smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Because your father was one of us, and now, whether you like it or not, so are you." Subscribe to American Fables for more.